When Shaq O'Neal walked into a prestigious bank to cash a check, he expected professionalism, but instead, he faced humiliation because he is black. What the bank manager didn't realize, that man wasn't just any customer. What happened next left the entire room in stunned silence. Subscribe Storyboat and let us know, where are you watching from? The glass doors of the Crownstone Bank in downtown Nashville swung open on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, and in walked a man who immediately commanded attention. Standing over 7 feet tall and built like a brick wall, Shaquille O'Neal, known to the world as Shaq, moved with a surprising grace for someone his size. His tailored gray suit fit perfectly, a testament to custom craftsmanship, and the bright red tie added a playful touch to his otherwise serious attire. As Shaq stepped inside, the polished marble floors reflected his confident stride. The air smelled of leather chairs and freshly polished wood, and soft murmurs of conversations floated in the high-ceiling space. Despite the luxurious surroundings, Shaq's demeanor was calm and unassuming. He didn't flash his signature grin or make a big entrance. He simply walked up to the teller counter, holding a folded check in his massive hand. "Good afternoon," he said in a deep but friendly voice, nodding at the young teller behind the desk. "I'd like to cash this check, please." The teller, a petite woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Mia, looked up, her polite smile faltering slightly as she took in the man towering over her. For a moment, she seemed to freeze, but then her professionalism kicked in. "Of course, sir," Mia said, her voice steady, though her hands fumbled slightly as she reached for the check. When she unfolded it, her eyebrows rose ever so slightly at the amount written on it, an amount that would make anyone's heart skip a beat. This will need the manager's approval," she said, glancing nervously toward a door at the back of the bank. "Please wait just a moment." Shaq nodded, his expression still calm. "Take your time, no rush." As Mia disappeared through the door to fetch the manager, Shaq took a step back from the counter, folding his hands in front of him. He glanced around the bank, observing the mix of customers and employees. A middle-aged man in a worn-out jacket shuffled papers at the far end of the lobby, his shoulders slumped as if carrying a heavy burden. Nearby, a mother tried to calm her fidgeting toddler while filling out a form. 2 sharply dressed executives chatted quietly by the coffee machine, their laughter muted but rehearsed. Shaq had always been good at reading people. Years of basketball fame had taught him to notice the smallest details in a person's posture, their expressions, the way they held themselves. He could see it now. The quiet tension in the room, the unspoken weight carried by the people around him. The bank might have been adorned with polished wood and gleaming chandeliers, but for most people, money was a source of stress, not comfort. A small commotion broke his thoughts. The door to the bank opened again, and a man in his late 20s stumbled in, clutching a worn leather backpack. His face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were neat but slightly rumpled, and he kept tugging at the hem of his jacket as though trying to reassure himself. Shaq noticed him immediately. The man's movements were jittery, his breathing shallow. He reminded Shaq of a teammate he once knew, someone who had struggled silently with anxiety, but tried to mask it with forced energy. Shaq's eyes softened. He had always been the type to look out for people, to extend kindness where it was needed. The man hesitated near the entrance, then moved toward the row of deposit slips. His hands trembled as he picked up a pen, and Shaq could see him struggling to focus. Without thinking, Shaq stepped closer. "Hey man," he said, his voice low and easy. "You okay?" The man startled, his head snapping up. For a moment, he just stared at Shaq, as if trying to process the fact that this giant of a man was speaking to him. Then he nodded quickly, his movements sharp and unconvincing. Yeah, I'm fine." Shaq tilted his head, his tone gentle but firm. "You sure?" You don't look fine. No shame in admitting it. The man hesitated, his grip tightening on the pen. For a moment, it looked like he might walk away, but then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a shaky breath. I just need to get this done, he said, holding up the deposit slip. His voice cracked slightly. It's for my mom. She's in the hospital and I need to pay the bills, but He broke off, his words tumbling over themselves. Shaq nodded slowly, his expression kind. What's your name? Darren, the man replied, barely above a whisper. Well, Darren, you're not alone, okay? We've all been there. Sometimes life throws more at us than we think we can handle. But trust me, you're stronger than you feel right now. Shaq's words were simple, but they carried weight, delivered with a sincerity that seemed to reach Darren. Darren blinked rapidly, as though fighting back tears. Thanks, he murmured, his voice tight. Shaq reached out and gave him a light pat on the shoulder, his large hand dwarfing Darren's frame. You've got this, he said. Then with a small smile he added, and hey, if you ever need a reminder of how strong you are, just look at me. If I can survive wearing those crazy gold shoes in the 90s, you can get through this. Darren chuckled despite himself, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. For a moment, the weight of his worries didn't seem quite as heavy. Mia returned to the counter, the manager, Mr. Peterson, following close behind. Mr. Peterson was a wiry man in his late 50s, with sharp glasses and an expression that tried too hard to appear welcoming. His voice was polite, but lacked warmth as he greeted Shaq. Good afternoon, Mr. O'Neill. Mia tells me you're here to open a new account, Mr. Peterson said, extending a hand. Shaq shook it firmly, his grip careful to match the older man's strength. That's right. I'm looking to keep it simple, checking and savings. I'm not big on too many bells and whistles. Peterson nodded. Of course, we can set you up with something straightforward. If you'll just follow me to my office, we can take care of the paperwork. Shaq glanced back at Darren, who was now sitting on one of the chairs near the corner, staring blankly at his phone. He hesitated for a moment before following Peterson. Lead the way. The manager's office was small but tidy, with a polished desk and neatly stacked files. Peterson motioned for Shaq to sit across from him as he opened a drawer to pull out some forms. You'll need to fill out these documents and will also require 2 forms of ID, he said, sliding a pen across the desk. Shaq nodded, pulling out his wallet. No problem. Let me know if there's anything else you need. As Peterson began explaining the account options, Shaq found his mind drifting back to Darren. Something about the young man's anxious demeanor lingered with him. Shaq had met countless people over the years, but there was a fragility in Darren that struck a chord. It reminded him of a time early in his own career when he had struggled to adjust to the pressures of fame. Back then, he had been lucky to have mentors who had guided him, who had offered encouragement when he'd needed it most. Mr. O'Neill, Peterson's voice snapped Shaq back to the present. Sorry, I zoned out for a second, Shaq admitted with a sheepish grin. What were you saying? Peterson gave a small, tight smile. I was explaining the benefits of our premium checking account. It might be a better fit given your financial profile. Shaq shook his head. I appreciate that, but like I said, I want to keep it simple. Basic checking and savings are all I need. Peterson nodded, though his expression betrayed a hint of disappointment. Understood. Let's proceed with that then. As they worked through the paperwork, Shaq kept one ear on the activity outside the office. The bank had grown quieter, but the sound of someone pacing caught his attention. A glance through the glass door revealed Darren, who was now walking back and forth near the counter, his hands clenched at his sides. Excuse me for a second, Shaq said, standing abruptly. Peterson blinked in surprise. Is something wrong? Shaq waved a hand. "Just need a quick break. Be right back." He stepped out of the office and approached Darren, who froze mid-step when he saw Shaq coming toward him. "Darren," Shaq said gently, "you doing okay? You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Darren hesitated, then shook his head. "It's nothing. I'm just waiting for my turn." Shaq crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, his towering presence both calming and commanding. "You're a terrible liar, you know that?" he said with a small chuckle. "Talk to me, man. What's going on?" Darren hesitated again, his face conflicted. Finally, he blurted out, I don't have enough. For my mom's treatment. I thought I'd have enough, but there were extra costs, and now I'm short." His words tumbled out in a rush, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." Shaq's expression softened. He could see the desperation in Darren's eyes, the quiet panic of someone who felt out of options. "How much are you short?" he asked gently. Darren looked down at his feet, mumbling a number so low Shaq could barely hear it. "Say it again?" Shaq prompted. 500, Darren said, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq nodded slowly, considering his words carefully. "Darren, you've got to learn something right now. There's no shame in asking for help when you need it. Life's hard enough without trying to carry everything on your own." Darren shook his head quickly. "I can't. I don't want to owe anyone." Shaq smiled. "Then don't think of it as owing. Think of it as a loan you can pay back whenever you're able. No interest, no pressure, just one human helping another." Darren's eyes filled with tears, and he shook his head again, though this time it seemed less resolute. I don't know." Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He thumbed through it until he found 5 crisp $100 bills, then pressed them into Darren's hand. "No arguments," he said firmly. "Take this and take care of your mom. That's all that matters right now." Darren stared at the money in his hand, his eyes wide with disbelief. I don't know what to say." "Say thank you," Shaq said with a grin. "And promise me you'll pay it forward when you're in a position to help someone else. Deal?" Darren nodded quickly, his voice thick with emotion. "Deal. Thank you. Thank you so much." Shaq clapped him on the shoulder, his grin widening. "You're gonna be okay, Darren. I believe in you." As Darren walked away to complete his transaction, a renewed determination in his step, Shaq felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. He had always believed that success wasn't just about what you achieved, but about how you used it to lift others. And in that moment, he knew he had made the right choice. After Darren left, Shaq returned to Mr. Peterson's office, but his mind lingered on the encounter. Something about Darren's struggle stirred memories of his own humble beginnings. Shaq had once been in a similar position, unsure of his next step, unsure if he could make it through. The thought planted a seed in his mind, one that would take root over the next few days. As the week went on, Shaq couldn't shake the memory of Darren's desperate expression or the quiet determination in his voice when he accepted help. It wasn't just the money. It was the sense of hopelessness Shaq recognized all too well. It reminded him of the young athletes he had mentored over the years, many of whom had faced impossible odds to chase their dreams. On Friday afternoon, Shaq decided to stop by the bank again. He didn't have any pressing business, but he felt a strange pull, a need to check in. When he entered, Mia greeted him with a wide smile. "Back so soon, Mr. O'Neill?" she teased. "Just Shaq," he reminded her with a chuckle. "And yeah, figured I'd drop by. Is Darren around?" Mia's smile faltered slightly. "He's here, but..." She hesitated, glancing toward the back. "He's been having a rough time lately. Something about his mom's treatment. I think he's worried it might not be enough." Shaq nodded thoughtfully. Can you let him know I'd like to see him? No rush. Just whenever he's got a moment. Mia nodded, disappearing into the staff area. A few minutes later, Darren emerged, looking surprised and a little apprehensive. Shaq? You wanted to see me? He asked, his voice unsure. Yeah, Shaq said, motioning to one of the chairs in the waiting area. Come sit with me for a bit. Darren hesitated, glancing around nervously, but eventually sat down. His posture was tense, his hands fidgeting in his lap. I just wanted to check on you, Shaq began, his tone calm and steady. How's your mom doing? Darren looked down, his shoulders slumping. She's stable for now. The treatment's helping, but it's expensive. Even with the help you gave me, it's still a lot to manage. I've been working extra shifts, trying to keep up. Shaq studied him for a moment, then leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. You know, when I was your age, my mom used to work 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. She never let me see how hard it was for her, but I knew. That's why I promised myself I'd do whatever it took to make her proud, to give her the life she deserved. Darren looked up, his expression softening. That must have been tough. It was, Shaq admitted. But it taught me something important. You don't have to do it all alone. There's no shame in leaning on people who care about you. And sometimes, strangers can turn into allies when you least expect it. Darren was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching Shaq's face. Finally, he asked, Why do you care? You don't even know me. Shaq smiled. Because I see a lot of myself in you, and because I know what it feels like to carry a weight that feels too heavy to bear. If I can help lighten that load, even a little, then why wouldn't I? Darren's eyes welled with tears, but he quickly blinked them away. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to thank me, Shaq said, his tone firm but kind. What you do from here, that's what matters. You've got the strength to get through this. I see it in you. Their conversation was interrupted by Mia, who approached hesitantly. Sorry to bother you, Shaq, but Mr. Peterson wanted to speak with you before you leave. Shaq nodded, standing. He turned back to Darren, clapping him on the shoulder. Take care of yourself, Darren, and remember what I said. Lean on people when you need to. You're not alone. As Shaq walked toward Peterson's office, Darren sat back in his chair, his mind racing. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. As Shaq walked into Mr. Peterson's office, the door clicking shut behind him, the tension from the conversation with Darren lingered in his chest. He had grown up learning that it was important to give back, but this situation felt different. It wasn't just about charity, it was about hope. About seeing someone in need, someone like his younger self, and deciding to make a difference. It was something deeper than just financial help. Mr. Peterson, seated behind his desk, didn't waste any time getting to the point. Shaq, I'm glad you stopped by. There's an opportunity I want you to think about. Shaq raised an eyebrow. What's that? Peterson slid a folder across the desk, the weight of it clearly important. We've been working on a new initiative here at the bank. We're trying to help young people like Darren, who are facing financial struggles and need guidance. We want to start a mentorship program, pairing them up with someone who can give them advice, help them with their goals, and, most importantly, be there when things get tough. Shaq felt a spark of interest. And you want me to be a mentor? Exactly, Peterson said. You've been through it all. You've got the experience and the heart for it. People respect you. You can reach them in a way others can't. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the edge of the table. He wasn't sure if he was ready for such a big commitment. He'd been juggling his own life, his career, and all the other responsibilities he had. But then, As he thought back to Darren, to the promise he'd made to him, something inside him clicked. "I've got to admit, I never thought about being a mentor," Shaq said slowly. "But I've seen how hard it can be to figure things out on your own. And I've had people who've helped me along the way. Maybe I can give back in the same way." Mr. Peterson smiled. "I knew you'd see the value in it. I'll leave this with you. Think it over. But you're the kind of person who could really make a difference in someone's life." Shaq stood up, taking the folder. He didn't know exactly what it would mean to be a mentor, but he knew that he was already doing something important by talking to people like Darren. This was just another step, another way to pass on the knowledge and experience that he had gained through his own struggles. When he left the office, the weight of the decision settled heavily on his shoulders. He didn't want to rush into anything, but he also knew that this wasn't a chance that would come around again. He would have to take the time to really think about what being a mentor would mean, not just to him, but to the young people he would be helping. That evening, as Shaq relaxed at home, he reflected on his own journey. From growing up in the projects to becoming one of the most recognizable names in basketball, he had faced challenges. The road had never been easy, and there had been times when he felt like he couldn't go any further. But each time he faced a setback, there had been someone there, whether it was his family, his coaches, or even strangers, who had helped him stay on course. What had helped him most during those times was knowing that he wasn't alone. That's what he hoped to offer Darren and others like him. A sense that no matter how tough things got, there was always a way forward. The next day, Shaq made his decision. He called Mr. Peterson and told him he was in. "I'm ready to be a mentor," Shaq said. "I want to help guide these young people, to show them that they don't have to face their struggles alone." Peterson's voice cracked with surprise and gratitude. "That's great, Shaq. I knew you'd be perfect for this." After the call, Shaq stood in front of the mirror, feeling a sense of pride mixed with uncertainty. He was stepping into something new, something that would push him out of his comfort zone. But he knew it was the right choice. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about using his position to change lives. And maybe, just maybe, it was his chance to give someone the kind of support he had received when he needed it most. Later that week, Shaq sat down with Darren at the bank again, this time for a different kind of conversation. He had something important to tell him. "Darren," Shaq said, his voice steady but full of meaning, "I've decided to join a mentorship program here at the bank, and I want to offer you the chance to be part of it. I believe you've got what it takes to make it through these hard times and come out stronger." Darren looked at him, surprised and confused. "Wait, you want me to be your mentee?" Shaq smiled, nodding. "I don't just want to help you with the money. I want to help you with your future, with your goals. I want to help you learn the things that can get you where you want to go in life." Darren's eyes welled up with emotion again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of hope. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Shaq said gently. "Just know that you've got someone in your corner, someone who believes in you." As Darren sat there trying to process everything, Shaq knew that this was just the beginning. It wasn't just about money or advice. It was about building a future together. It was about helping someone rise above their circumstances and show them that, with the right support, anything was possible. Weeks passed since Shaq committed to the mentorship program. As the days went by, he found himself growing more excited about the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of young people like Darren. It wasn't just about giving them advice or offering financial support. It was about showing them that there was always a way forward, no matter how difficult things seemed. Shaq's first meeting with Darren after he agreed to mentor him was unlike any other conversation they had shared. They were sitting in a quiet corner of the coffee shop, Shaq's towering figure looming over the small table as Darren looked up at him, nervous but hopeful. Shaq knew this moment meant everything to Darren. It could be the turning point in his life. The moment when he realized that there were still people who cared about him. "Darren," Shaq began, his voice calm but steady, "I'm glad you agreed to take part in this program. I know you've been through a lot, but I want you to understand something. Life isn't always going to be easy. There are going to be times when you feel like everything's falling apart. But it's in those moments that you need to remember this. There is always another chance. There is always a way out." Darren nodded slowly, absorbing every word. "I want to believe that," he said quietly. "But sometimes it feels like I'm running out of time. Like I'm stuck, and I don't know what to do next." Shaq smiled warmly, leaning in slightly. "That's exactly why we're having this conversation. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. What you need to do is take it one step at a time. Start small. You've already come so far just by deciding to turn things around. That's something not everyone can do." Darren's eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm just scared, Shaq. I don't want to end up like my friends. I don't want to fall back into the same mistakes." Shaq leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. He understood Darren's fear all too well. Growing up in a tough neighborhood, Shaq had seen countless friends make choices that led them down the wrong path. He had lost many people along the way, and the pain of those losses still weighed heavily on him. "Fear is natural," Shaq said, his voice low but reassuring. "But you can't let it control you. You need to turn that fear into motivation. Let it drive you to do better, to make smarter decisions. And trust me, there will be setbacks. Nobody's perfect. But it's about getting back up when you fall, not staying down. I've been there." Darren's eyes met Shaq's, and for the first time in a long while, he saw hope in them. He didn't feel like he was facing this alone anymore. It wasn't just about the mentorship program. It was about the connection they had formed, the trust they had built in such a short amount of time. As their meeting continued, Shaq shared stories from his own life, stories of struggle, perseverance, and the people who had helped him along the way. He spoke about his early days in basketball, the hours of practice, the sacrifices, the moments when he doubted himself. But he also spoke about the moments of triumph, the feeling of overcoming obstacles, and the power of believing in yourself. Darren listened intently, his mind racing with the possibilities. He had always admired Shaq from a distance, but now he saw him in a new light. Shaq wasn't just a famous basketball player. He was a real person, someone who had walked through the same struggles and came out the other side stronger. That gave Darren a sense of courage he had never felt before. "I want to start making better choices," Darren said, his voice filled with determination. "I don't want to be stuck anymore. I want to do something with my life." Shaq grinned, proud of Darren for taking the first step. "That's what I want to hear. It's all about taking action. It's not going to happen overnight, but as long as you're committed, I'll be here to help you every step of the way." Over the next few months, Shaq and Darren met regularly, their bond growing stronger with each conversation. Shaq helped Darren set goals, both short-term and long-term, and they worked together to break down the steps Darren needed to take to achieve them. Shaq introduced Darren to people in his network, people who could offer him opportunities and advice. They worked on practical skills, financial management, time management, and how to navigate the challenges of adulthood. But the most important thing Shaq offered Darren was his unwavering support. Whenever Darren faced setbacks, whether it was losing a job, dealing with personal issues, or struggling to stay focused, Shaq was there. reminding him of his worth and potential. He never let Darren give up on himself, even when it felt like everything was falling apart. Through it all, Darren started to believe in himself. Slowly but surely, he began to turn his life around. He enrolled in a trade program, determined to build a better future for himself. He started working part-time, saving money, and learning how to budget. With each small success, his confidence grew, and he began to see the possibilities that had once seemed out of reach. Shaq was there through it all, celebrating the wins and comforting him during the losses. He was more than just a mentor. He had become a true friend, someone who understood the challenges Darren faced and was always ready to lend a helping hand. One day, as they sat in the same coffee shop where they had met months before, Darren looked across the table at Shaq, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know where I'd be without you," he said quietly. Shaq smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You'd be just fine, Darren. But I'm glad I could be part of your journey. You've done all the hard work. I just helped guide you along the way." Darren nodded, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I'll never forget what you've done for me. I won't let you down." Shaq leaned forward, his tone serious. "You don't need to worry about that. Just keep moving forward. Keep working hard. That's all anyone can ask." And as they sat there, two men from different worlds connected by their shared struggles, Shaq knew that the impact of this mentorship program had gone far beyond what he had imagined. It wasn't just about giving back. It was about creating a ripple effect that would change lives, one person at a time. Months had passed since Darren had first walked into the coffee shop to meet Shaq, uncertain of what his life could become. His transformation had been gradual, but undeniable. Shaq had become more than just a mentor. He had become a father figure, a guide who showed Darren how to navigate the complexities of life in a way that no one else had. And now, as they sat together again, something had shifted. The man sitting across from Darren was not the same person he had been when they first met. Darren had changed too. He was no longer the same lost young man who had walked through those doors a few months ago. He sat up straighter now, his eyes focused and his voice steady. Shaq had helped him build more than just a career path. He had helped him rebuild his sense of self-worth. But there was still a long way to go, and both of them knew it. This meeting felt different, though. There was a new sense of hope in the air, a sense that Darren was finally starting to believe in his potential. Darren glanced across the table at Shaq, who was sitting comfortably, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. The towering figure before him was calm and collected, but there was a certain warmth in Shaq's eyes that Darren had come to cherish. It was a reminder that someone, even someone as famous and accomplished as Shaq, truly cared about him. "I'm not sure where to go from here," Darren said, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq looked at him with a raised eyebrow, clearly not satisfied with the uncertainty in his tone. "What do you mean by that?" "I've been doing everything you've told me to do. I've been saving, working hard, keeping my head down. But sometimes it feels like I'm not making any progress. Like I'm just stuck, you know?" Shaq leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful as he considered Darren's words. He had heard this before from people at different points in their journeys. It wasn't uncommon for someone to feel stuck, especially when they were working hard, but hadn't yet seen the results they hoped for. It was a feeling that could easily cause someone to give up. But Shaq knew better. He had seen it in his own life, in his own career. Things rarely moved quickly, and success didn't come overnight. "Let me tell you something," Shaq said slowly, looking Darren directly in the eye. "When I first started, I wasn't the superstar you see today. I wasn't winning championships. I wasn't dominating the game. I had a lot of obstacles in my path, a lot of people telling me I wouldn't make it. But I kept pushing through, even when things seemed impossible." Darren listened closely, his eyes still fixed on Shaq's face, trying to absorb the weight of his words. "Everything you're going through right now," Shaq continued, "is part of your journey. You can't rush it. You have to be patient with yourself. Growth doesn't always happen in the ways you expect. But you've come so far already. Just think about where you were when we first met, and where you are now. You've got a steady job. You're paying bills, saving money, staying out of trouble. Those are big wins. Most people can't say that." Darren nodded, unsure how to express the way he felt. He had worked hard, but it never felt like enough. There were still times when he lay awake at night, questioning whether he was on the right path, or if he was just fooling himself into thinking that things could get better. "I know I'm not where I want to be yet," Darren said quietly. "But sometimes it feels like I'm not even moving at all, like I'm just doing the same thing every day." Shaq smiled softly, his eyes filled with understanding. "That's because you're still in the process, man. You're building a foundation, and foundations take time. You're not supposed to see huge changes right away. It's the small things that matter, the daily choices you make. That's how you build something solid." Darren felt a small sense of relief at Shaq's words. It wasn't that he hadn't heard similar advice before, but when it came from someone like Shaq, it somehow felt more real. He had watched Shaq rise from a young player in college to one of the most dominant forces in basketball. He had witnessed firsthand the discipline and dedication it took to reach the top, and now he was seeing that same kind of dedication applied to his own life, not just in basketball, but in every decision he made. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Darren said, looking down at his hands. "About the importance of patience. I guess I've always been in a hurry. My whole life I've always wanted things to happen fast. But they never did. And when they didn't, I just gave up. But now I'm starting to think maybe it's okay to take things slow." Shaq's eyes lit up at Darren's words. "Exactly. Patience is the key. You've got to learn to trust the process. There's no shortcut to success, Darren. You have to put in the work, and the results will follow." There was a moment of silence as both men sat in contemplation, each reflecting on their own experiences. Shaq had lived through so many challenges, but he had never given up. And now, as he looked at Darren, he could see a glimmer of the same determination in him. It was a powerful thing, seeing someone realize their potential and take charge of their own destiny. Darren leaned forward, his voice filled with a new sense of resolve. "I don't want to keep waiting for something to happen. I want to make it happen." Shaq smiled broadly, a proud grin spreading across his face. "That's what I like to hear. You've got the fire inside of you, Darren. Now you just have to keep feeding it. Don't let anyone, not even yourself, put that fire out." For the first time in months, Darren felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. The path ahead was still unclear in many ways, but the uncertainty didn't feel as daunting anymore. He had the tools now. He had learned how to set goals, how to manage his time, how to stay disciplined, and most importantly, he had the confidence to keep pushing forward, even when things didn't go as planned. As they stood up to leave the coffee shop, Shaq clapped Darren on the back with a firm but friendly gesture. "Keep working hard, Darren. And remember, I'm always here if you need me. Don't hesitate to reach out. You've got this." Darren felt a swell of gratitude in his chest, a warmth that spread from the tips of his fingers to the pit of his stomach. "Thanks, Shaq. I really mean it. I don't think I'd be here without you." Shaq winked at him. "You'd be just fine, but I'm glad I could help. Now go out there and show the world what you're made of." As Darren stepped out of the coffee shop, a sense of clarity washed over him. He didn't have all the answers, and there were still challenges ahead. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He had learned that success wasn't about instant gratification. It was about perseverance, patience, and believing in yourself, even when it felt like the world was against you. With Shaq's words echoing in his mind, Darren walked into his future, ready to face whatever came next. Darren spent the next few weeks feeling like he was finally starting to get his life together. He had gotten back into a solid routine, waking up early every morning, hitting the gym, and staying focused on his work. He kept his finances in check, and with every passing day, his confidence grew. Shaq's words echoed in his mind like a mantra. Trust the process. Patience is key. It wasn't easy, but Darren was learning to take things one step at a time. But as it often happens, life has a way of throwing curveballs when we think we have everything under control. It was a Friday evening when Darren received a phone call that would change everything. He had just finished his shift at the restaurant and was looking forward to a quiet night. But as he checked his phone, he saw the name Lena flashing on the screen. She was a former girlfriend from his past, someone he hadn't spoken to in months. She had always been a source of chaos in his life, a relationship that, while passionate, was full of drama and uncertainty. He had let her go when he realized how toxic things had become. But now, seeing her name on the screen, Darren felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He hesitated for a moment, but then decided to answer. "Hey, Lena," he said cautiously, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Darren," Lena's voice sounded strained, like she was holding back tears. "I need your help. It's really bad." Darren's heart sank. He had no idea what was going on, but from the sound of her voice, he knew it wasn't good. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to stay calm. Lena took a deep breath before speaking again. "I don't know how to say this, but I'm in trouble. I need money. A lot of money. And I don't know where else to turn." Darren paused, his mind racing. He hadn't heard from Lena in months, and now, out of the blue, she was asking for money. His first instinct was to shut the conversation down. After all, hadn't he learned to distance himself from people who brought negativity into his life? But something in her voice made him hesitate. He still cared for her, even though he knew their relationship was unhealthy. He couldn't help but wonder what had happened to her and why she was in such a desperate situation. "Lena, what happened?" Darren asked, his voice softer now. I got into some bad situations, Darren," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I made some mistakes. I've got some debts I can't pay, and now they're threatening me. They said if I don't come up with the money, they're going to hurt me." Darren felt a rush of emotions all at once: anger, frustration, and even fear. He had seen Lena struggle before, but this felt different. The desperation in her voice was real, and the thought of her being hurt scared him more than he cared to admit. "Who's threatening you?" Darren asked, his voice firm now, almost protective. "I can't say," Lena replied quickly. "But please, Darren, I need you. I don't have anyone else." Darren was quiet for a moment, trying to process everything she had said. He thought about Shaq's advice, about staying focused, about not letting old patterns pull him back into unhealthy situations. But at the same time, he couldn't just ignore Lena. She was in trouble, and no matter how hard he tried to convince himself to walk away, he knew he couldn't leave her hanging. "I'll help," Darren said after a long pause, his voice steady. "But you need to be honest with me, no more lies. Lena, tell me everything. I can't help you if I don't know the whole story." Lena let out a relieved sigh, as if she had been holding her breath. "Thank you, Darren. I promise I'll explain everything. I just don't know who else to turn to." Over the next few hours, Lena revealed the full extent of her troubles. It turned out that she had gotten involved with some dangerous people during her time in the city. She had borrowed money from them, and now they were demanding repayment with interest. The debts had spiraled out of control, and Lena found herself trapped in a situation she didn't know how to escape. Darren felt his stomach churn as he listened to her story. It was a reminder of just how chaotic her life had been. And as much as he cared about her, he couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. Helping her might mean putting himself in danger. But, as much as he tried to rationalize it, Darren knew he couldn't just walk away. He had to find a way to help her without getting sucked back into the same toxic relationship they had shared. He had worked so hard to get to this point in his life, he couldn't let it all fall apart because of one phone call. The next morning, Darren went to meet with Shaq. He hadn't told him about Lena yet, but he knew he needed advice. Shaq had been through so many challenges in his life, both on and off the court. If anyone could give him some guidance, it was Shaq. They sat in the same coffee shop where they had had so many conversations before. Darren took a deep breath and looked Shaq in the eyes. "I got a call last night," Darren said, his voice tight. "It was Lena. She's in trouble, and she needs my help." Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly, his face serious as he listened to Darren's story. When Darren finished explaining everything, Shaq sat back in his chair, looking thoughtful. "Darren, you've been working hard to rebuild your life. You've been focused, disciplined. But sometimes, life doesn't go the way we expect it to. People from our past will try to pull us back into old habits, old relationships, and old problems." Shaq paused, his voice steady. "You have to decide right now whether you're going to let that happen or whether you're going to stay focused on your own journey." Darren nodded slowly, his mind wrestling with the decision. He wanted to help Lena, but he didn't want to lose everything he had worked so hard for. "Helping her could mean putting myself in danger," Darren said, his voice filled with doubt. Shaq leaned forward, his expression firm but understanding. "That's the risk you have to weigh, Darren. It's not an easy decision. But at the end of the day, you have to look out for yourself first. You can't save anyone if you're drowning too." The words hit Darren like a punch to the gut. He had spent so much time trying to fix other people's problems that he had forgotten to focus on his own. Shaq clapped him on the back. "Remember, you can still care about people without letting them drag you down. Don't let the past control your future." Darren sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Shaq's words sinking in. He knew what he had to do. Darren spent the next few days lost in thought. The conversation with Shaq had stayed with him, echoing in his mind. Shaq's words felt like a wake-up call, reminding him of the progress he had made and the importance of not letting old habits pull him back. Yet, the weight of his past relationship with Lena hung heavily on him. He knew she was in trouble, and part of him felt like he had no choice but to help her. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his own well-being had to come first. He sat in his small apartment one evening, staring at the flickering lights of the city outside his window. The apartment felt quieter than usual, almost too quiet. His mind raced as he replayed the events of the past few weeks. He had been working so hard to rebuild his life, staying focused on his goals, his fitness, his financial stability. He had been working tirelessly to become someone he could be proud of, someone who didn't let his past define him. But now, here was Lena, a part of his past he had tried so hard to leave behind, calling him for help. Her voice, full of desperation and fear, had shaken him. He cared about her deeply, but he also knew the damage their relationship had caused. The chaos, the lies, the manipulation. He couldn't forget any of it. Helping her now could pull him back into that world, a world he had fought so hard to escape. But then, a thought crossed his mind. Maybe there was a way to help her without getting too involved. Maybe he didn't have to throw everything he had worked for away. He could help, but from a distance. He didn't have to get sucked back into the drama, the lies, and the toxicity. He could offer practical support, without letting her back into his life completely. Darren knew he had to set boundaries this time. He couldn't let Lena's problems become his own. It wasn't about abandoning her. It was about protecting himself while still offering help. The decision was difficult, but he knew it was the only way forward. He had learned the hard way that helping someone wasn't always about jumping in head first. Sometimes it meant being strong enough to say no, even when your heart told you otherwise. The next morning, Darren reached out to Lena. His phone buzzed as soon as he sent the message. He had written it carefully, trying to be clear and firm without sounding cold. He needed to draw a line to make sure he wasn't stepping back into the mess that had once been his life with her. "I can help," the message read, "but it has to be on my terms. I won't get involved in anything dangerous. I'm not going back to that life with you. But I'll do what I can to help you get out of this situation." A few minutes later, Lena's response came through. It was full of emotion, as usual. She thanked him profusely and promised she would do whatever it took to get things right. Darren could hear the desperation in her words, but he had made up his mind. This time, he wouldn't let her pull him into the chaos. That afternoon, Darren met with Lena at a small cafe. She looked different from the last time he had seen her, more haggard, more worn. The dark circles under her eyes told the story of the stress she had been under. Darren spent the next few days lost in thought. The conversation with Shaq had stayed with him, echoing in his mind. Shaq's words felt like a wake-up call, reminding him of the progress he had made and the importance of not letting old habits pull him back. Yet, the weight of his past relationship with Lena hung heavily on him. He knew she was in trouble, and part of him felt like he had no choice but to help her. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his own well-being had to come first. He sat in his small apartment one evening, staring at the flickering lights of the city outside his window. The apartment felt quieter than usual, almost too quiet. His mind raced as he replayed the events of the past few weeks. He had been working so hard to rebuild his life, staying focused on his goals, his fitness, his financial stability. He had been working tirelessly to become someone he could be proud of, someone who didn't let his past define him. But now, here was Lena, a part of his past he had tried so hard to leave behind, calling him for help. Her voice, full of desperation and fear, had shaken him. He cared about her deeply, but he also knew the damage their relationship had caused. The chaos, the lies, the manipulation. He couldn't forget any of it. Helping her now could pull him back into that world, a world he had fought so hard to escape. But then, a thought crossed his mind. Maybe there was a way to help her without getting too involved. Maybe he didn't have to throw everything he had worked for away. He could help, but from a distance. He didn't have to get sucked back into the drama, the lies, and the toxicity. He could offer practical support without letting her back into his life completely. Darren knew he had to set boundaries this time. He couldn't let Lena's problems become his own. It wasn't about abandoning her. It was about protecting himself while still offering help. The decision was difficult, but he knew it was the only way forward. He had learned the hard way that helping someone wasn't always about jumping in head first. Sometimes, it meant being strong enough to say no, even when your heart told you otherwise. The next morning, Darren reached out to Lena. His phone buzzed as soon as he sent the message. He had written it carefully, trying to be clear and firm without sounding cold. He needed to draw a line, to make sure he wasn't stepping back into the mess that had once been his life with her. "I can help," the message read, "but it has to be on my terms. I won't get involved in anything dangerous. I'm not going back to that life with you, but I'll do what I can to help you get out of this situation." A few minutes later, Lena's response came through. It was full of emotion as usual. She thanked him profusely and promised she would do whatever it took to get things right. Darren could hear the desperation in her words, but he had made up his mind. This time, he wouldn't let her pull him into the chaos. That afternoon, Darren met with Lena at a small cafe. She looked different from the last time he had seen her, more haggard, more worn. The dark circles under her eyes told the story of the stress she had been under. He couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy, but at the same time, he reminded himself to stay grounded. He couldn't allow himself to get swept away by her emotions. "I'm glad you're here, Darren," Lena said, her voice shaky, as she sat down across from him. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and guilt. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Darren nodded, but didn't let himself soften too much. "Look, Lena, I'm not doing this to get back into the mess with you. I'm doing this because you're in trouble. But you need to know that this is the last time I'm getting involved. I've got my life together, and I'm not going to let you pull me back into that world." Lena's face faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "I understand. I really do. I don't want to drag you into this either, but I don't know who else to turn to. I've made some terrible decisions, Darren. I've hurt people, and now they're after me. I just need a way out." Darren took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation. "All right, we'll figure this out. But you have to be honest with me, Lena. No more lies. I can't help you if I don't know the full truth." Lena nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "The people I owe money to, they're not just anyone. They're dangerous. I thought I could handle it, but it spiraled out of control. I've tried to make payments, but the interest keeps growing, and they're getting more aggressive. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Darren listened carefully, his mind racing as he considered the options. He knew the best thing he could do was get her out of the situation without endangering himself. He couldn't let her drag him back into a world of crime, violence, and lies. But he also knew that the only way for her to get out of this mess was to break free from those people completely. It wasn't just about money. It was about her breaking free from a dangerous cycle. "I think the first step is to get you out of their reach," Darren said, his voice calm but firm. "You need to disappear for a while. Go somewhere safe. We'll figure out the money later, but right now, your safety is the priority. You can't keep living like this." Lena looked up at him, a mixture of relief and fear in her eyes. "You really think I can get away from them?" Darren nodded. "I do. But you have to trust me. You can't keep hiding in this life of fear and debt. We're going to take the next steps together, but it's going to take time, and it won't be easy." The next few hours were spent discussing a plan. Darren made a few phone calls to people he trusted, working out the details of how to get Lena out of the immediate danger. He wasn't sure if it would work, but he had to try. Lena couldn't keep living in fear. As they parted ways, Darren couldn't shake the feeling that this decision was a turning point for both of them. He had set a boundary with Lena, but he had also opened the door to helping her in a way that didn't compromise his own progress. He had chosen to be there for her, but only on his terms. As he walked away from the cafe, Darren felt a strange sense of peace. He had made the right decision, even if it hadn't been easy. He knew that sometimes the hardest choices were the ones that led to the most growth. A few days after Darren and Lena had met at the cafe, things began to take shape. Darren had been in constant contact with his trusted network, reaching out to a few people who could help Lena. His plan wasn't simple, but it was the only way he could see to protect her, while also ensuring that he didn't lose himself in the process. The first part of the plan involved getting Lena out of the immediate danger. Darren knew that the people who were after her wouldn't just let her walk away without consequences. He couldn't risk her staying in the city, where she would be easy to find. He contacted an old friend, a former colleague from his days in business, who had connections to a safe house in a quiet town a few hours away. The friend was sympathetic to Darren's situation, and though it wasn't ideal, he agreed to help. Lena didn't take the news well at first. She was scared. Scared of leaving everything behind. Scared of what might happen if she left without paying the debt. "I can't just run away," she said when Darren told her the plan. "They'll come after me no matter where I go. They won't stop until they get their money." Darren understood her fear. He had been in her shoes before, but he also knew that running wasn't just about avoiding the people who were chasing her. It was about breaking the cycle. Lena needed a fresh start, a chance to rebuild without the weight of her past dragging her down. If she stayed, the problems would only escalate, and she would only fall deeper into a hole. "You have to trust me," Darren said, his voice calm but firm. "If you stay, it'll only get worse. They won't just keep demanding money. They'll keep threatening you. They'll make your life a living hell. The only way out is to disappear, at least for now." Lena didn't respond right away. She stared at the ground, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as she processed the decision. The fear in her eyes was evident, but slowly she nodded. "Okay, I'll do it. But what about the money? I can't just leave them hanging." Darren had already thought about that. He had no intention of letting her go without taking some steps to address her debt, but he knew it couldn't be done overnight. The people Lena owed money to were dangerous, and any attempt to pay them off in a hurry would only make things worse. The best thing they could do was to take things slow, buy some time, and get Lena out of immediate danger. "I'll handle the money situation later," Darren said. "Right now you need to focus on getting safe. That's the priority. Once you're out of the city, we'll figure out the rest." The next day, Darren drove Lena to the safe house. It wasn't much, just a small, secluded cabin in the woods. But it was enough to get her out of harm's way for the time being. The place was well hidden, far from any major cities or busy roads. Lena was going to have to lay low for a while, but at least she would be safe. As they arrived, Lena looked around nervously, her hands shaking slightly. "Is this really going to work?" she asked, her voice full of doubt. "It has to," Darren replied. "This is the best option we have. You're going to stay here until things calm down, and I'll check in on you regularly. You won't be alone, and you won't be in danger anymore." Lena nodded, though her expression was still uncertain. "Thank you, Darren. I don't know how to repay you for this." "You don't have to," he said, his voice softening for a moment. "You're not alone anymore. That's all that matters." Darren stayed for a while, making sure Lena was settled in and that she had everything she needed. He made sure she understood that this was a temporary solution, but it was necessary. He didn't want to leave her there alone for too long, but at the same time, he knew he had to respect her space. She was going to have to take control of her own life again, and that meant he couldn't hover over her constantly. Before he left, he gave her a phone and told her to keep in touch. "If you need anything, call me. I'll be here to help you. But remember, you're not going back to that life. This is the start of a new chapter for you." As Darren drove away from the safe house, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. On one hand, he felt relief. Lena was safe, at least for now. He had done what he could, and now it was up to her to make the most of this opportunity. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that lingered in the back of his mind. He couldn't help but wonder if he was doing enough. Was it enough to just get her out of immediate danger? Or did he need to do more to help her truly escape from her past? The days that followed were tense. Darren kept checking in on Lena, making sure she was okay, but he didn't let himself get too involved. He knew that the moment he let himself become too emotionally invested again, he would be back in the same place he had been before. The place where Lena's problems became his problems, and where his own progress and well-being got lost in the chaos of her world. Lena, on the other hand, was beginning to settle into her new life. She had her doubts and fears, but the fact that she was no longer running from her past gave her a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. She was starting to realize that, for the first time in a long time, she had control over her own life. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. One evening, about a week after Lena had arrived at the safe house, Darren received a call from her. Her voice was calmer than it had been the last time they spoke. "I'm okay," she said. "I've been thinking a lot, and I want to get back on track. I want to make things right, not just with the money, but with my life." Darren smiled softly. He knew it wasn't going to be an easy road, but hearing Lena sound determined gave him hope. It was the first time in a long time that she seemed truly ready to make a change, and that made all the difference. "I'm proud of you, Lena," he said. "But remember, you don't have to do it alone. I'm here to help, whenever you need it." Lena's voice cracked slightly, a sign of the vulnerability that still lingered underneath her tough exterior. "Thank you. I don't deserve your help, but I'm going to try to make it count." Darren paused for a moment, letting the silence hang in the air. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew this wouldn't be an easy road for either of them. But he also knew that sometimes the most important thing you could do was to be there for someone, even from a distance, even when the road ahead was uncertain. As the conversation ended, Darren leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of peace. The path forward was unclear, but for the first time in a long time, he was confident that Lena was ready to take the steps necessary to rebuild her life. It was a long journey ahead, but at least she was no longer facing it alone. As Darius, or rather Shaquille O'Neal, made his way out of the bank, his heart wasn't heavy with the satisfaction of revenge. It wasn't about getting back at Simmons, nor was it about showing off his wealth or influence. No, it was about making sure that no one would ever be treated that way again, not under any circumstance. As he passed through the revolving doors, the sound of his footsteps echoed loudly, but there was something else in the air, something that couldn't be measured by any scale or currency. It was the weight of change. He glanced around at the faces of the customers, many of whom had witnessed the entire ordeal. Some avoided his gaze, while others exchanged uncertain glances, as if trying to process what had just happened. The woman at the counter, the one who had first greeted him, still seemed in shock, her hand pressed to her mouth as she stared in disbelief at the scene that had unfolded. The other employees, too, appeared stunned, caught between their sense of duty and the reality of the power dynamics at play. But it wasn't just the people in the bank who were affected. In the back of Shaq's mind, he knew that the impact of what had happened would ripple far beyond these walls. The conversation wouldn't end here. What had been exposed wasn't just a problem with one man, but with an entire culture of judgment where assumptions were made based on appearances or status rather than the facts. The lesson had been taught, and he hoped it would be one that everyone remembered. He had been calm, measured, and patient throughout the entire ordeal. But as he left the building, a slight smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Not because of the scene that had unfolded, but because he knew the truth. Change, no matter how slow, was happening. Outside, the crisp air of the city felt like a breath of fresh air. The hustle and bustle of the street continued as if nothing had happened, but in Shaq's mind, something had shifted. A part of him felt proud, not because of the confrontation, but because he had held his ground, remained true to his values, and reminded everyone of the importance of treating others with dignity. It wasn't about money or power. It was about respect. And that was something that no one could take away from him. As he walked towards his car, he couldn't help but think of the young teller. Her face had been one of uncertainty, but it had been clear she'd been affected by the events too. He hoped that someday she would look back on that moment and remember the lessons that had been taught. Maybe she would even take those lessons with her, not just in her work, but in every interaction she had from that point forward. Shaq's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his assistant. The message was simple, but it spoke volumes. "You did the right thing." Shaq smiled, slipping his phone back into his pocket as he got into his car. He wasn't seeking praise, but it always felt good to know that someone understood the importance of what had just transpired. As the car pulled away from the curb, Shaq looked back at the bank one last time. It was still standing there, just as it had been before, but for some reason, it felt different now. It was as if the weight of the actions that had taken place inside its walls would remain etched in the air. The staff, the customers, and even the bank's management, they had all witnessed something that hopefully would spark a deeper understanding of what it meant to treat people with respect and dignity. It wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. It was only the beginning. Shaq knew that change didn't happen overnight, but that didn't mean it wasn't possible. He had made his point, and now it was up to the rest of the world to follow suit. His actions weren't about glory or recognition, but about making sure that the next person who walked into that bank, or any bank for that matter, wouldn't have to go through what he had. For now, though, Shaq was content in the knowledge that he had done what he could. He had spoken up. He had made his voice heard, and he had done it with grace and dignity. As he drove off into the city streets, he looked ahead, knowing that the journey wasn't over. The world was full of challenges, but as long as people like him were willing to stand up for what was right, there was always hope for change. I hope you like this story. Subscribe Storyboat for daily upcoming stories like this.